Again, this is another episode of Speaking of Diversity and Inclusion with Andre Koen, the Program Director for the Office of Diversity and Inclusion. And today we have one of my good friends. We are social media friends. We met at a training, and we just clicked. It was like having a sister from another mister. I don't know. That was supposed to be funny. Oh, so Kate, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your practice and what projects you're currently working on?
Yeah, so I practice in Racine, Wisconsin. I practice in a small firm. I practice employment law, so most people don't know what that means. What it means kind of practically is I help small businesses in Kenosha, Racine, Milwaukee area with understanding the laws and kind of how to comply with the laws. Most small companies don't have legal departments or really even HR departments, so to speak. They'll have one person that kind of handles HR for them with a limited understanding of what that means from a legal perspective. So they'll consult with us in developing policies and procedures and kind of doing both tactical and strategic things for the company to make sure that they're in compliance with the law, protected, and that they're, taking care of their employees to the best of their ability.
So in your practice, in the work that you do, I'm sure. Well, I'm not sure about this, but I wonder, has the political climate that we're currently in created either challenges or opportunities for you to help small businesses? What are some of the things that they're facing given employment and looking at employment law in this particular kind of polarized political environment?
Yeah, I guess the most effect I've seen from the political climate has to do with employers in regards to like immigration reform and just making sure that all their immigration, all their I-9 employment verification stuff is, done properly. And I don't mean that their employees are eligible to work necessarily, but that everything's filled out correctly because there's increased oversight in that area. Surprisingly, like the Me Too movement, I don't see a lot of increase in discrimination complaints. I see it a little bit, and I kind of, try to give my clients a heads up that, hey, we need to be really cognizant of this because it's a big issue right now. Things are starting to come out, so we need to make sure that you have the policy procedures in place so that you're aware when things are happening and kind of can address them head on, because that's been a lot of the focus of the Me Too movement, is not just that these things are happening, but that these things are being completely swept under the rug by big organizations, thereby making them kind of complicit in the discrimination and the harassment.
So I mean, I would have, had you, before kind of the Me Too movement started catching popular attention and getting steam, I would have said, if you would have just asked me, I would have said that sexual harassment in the workplace was a thing of the past, that there is no real need to even focus a whole lot on sexual harassment. Why do you think the Me Too movement really uncovered that or rediscovered or captured our attention on the fact that is not a truism? That things aren't, that we're not past sexism or whatnot. What do you think was the impetus for that?
Well, I think that, perspectives being different. From my perspective, before the Me Too movement, I would have told you that it is still an issue in the workplace, not necessarily from my legal work, but from my, 10 years in corporate America. Before that, I experienced a lot of it. I saw many people get fired for it. So I do think that before the Me Too movement, to me, it was still a very real thing. I think the presence or the availability of social media and the ability to be a little bit ambiguous but have a platform to talk about issues, just like Black Lives Matter and just like other kind of social issues, it's a platform for it to talk about it in a way that's a little bit less confrontational, and a little bit more comfortable for people, even though it's a little counterintuitive because it's kind of public, but at the same time, you're not sitting down across the table from your aunt and uncle and telling them something, but they're still seeing the message. So I think that has a lot to do with it. I don't think that it ever went away.
So when we think about, so you do employment law, do you ever bump up against affirmative action or the people's unwillingness or uncomfortable dealing with or talking about affirmative action? How do you deal with that?
Oh, yeah, I mean, it's a challenge. I think the biggest challenge is that people aren't as forthcoming with whatever racism, sexism, whatever ism that they believe in or they hold true or as part of their guide. They're not forthcoming with it. So it's hard to determine, is that shaping their beliefs about employment or about their employment culture? So I think that's the most difficult part. Is affirmative action is a really ambiguous term that we use, and the government has told us we need to take affirmative action, but has not really given us any guidance for what that means. So I think people are afraid to do anything.
Yeah. So what kinds of things are people doing? And yet, what are you seeing in your work in terms of, since the government hasn't given us clear guidance on that, although they have the EEO report that suggests setting goals around different statuses within an organization. What are you seeing that people are doing?
Well, I think most companies will have a policy that says they're an equal opportunity employer, which is great. It kind of raises the awareness of the issue. But I mean, honestly, are there tools that companies are using? Small companies, not necessarily. Are they keeping track of the race of or the gender of the people who are applying and then kind of analyzing that? Not really, mostly because they don't have the means, and to them it doesn't seem like a large issue. They're looking at each applicant as an applicant, not based on their race and gender or any other protected class that they might be a member of. The problem with that is that we all have implicit bias, right? Like, I might not believe that I have a bias against one type of person, but it's there. So it's hard to kind of, you can't create a chart to say, well, my implicit bias is putting this person 2 points down. So you really, have to challenge, well, what are the things I can quantify about this candidate or this employee to make it fair, to counteract or offset that bias.
Yeah. So
it's really difficult.
So we'll come back to implicit bias in just a second. You talked about something, a protected class. What is a protected class? What does that mean?
Okay, so a protected class it's actually defined by the government. The federal government has created, through a variety of different laws, classes of people that, because of either historical oppression or their minority status, deserve extra protection, basically a second look. So if something happens to this particular group of people, let's look at it and say, is it because of their historical oppression, or is it because of some discrimination against this group of people? So, you know, the federal government has said that, you know, someone's race, someone's religion, their national origin, age, sex, pregnancy, citizenship, familial status, disability status, all of those things, veteran status, all of those things put them in this protected class of people.
Okay. So a protected class is not necessarily synonymous with a minority, but a minority could be within a protected class.
Yeah, they're not mutually exclusive or inclusive. You know, obviously gender, female, well, gender. So here's the funny thing about protected class. It doesn't necessarily have to be, you know, that women are in a protected class. It's that sex is a protected class. So it could be that the discrimination is against the male gender, but if they're discriminated against based on their sex in some way, that's impermissible. Same thing with race. We think, when we think about protected class and discrimination, we think, well, you know, African American people are discriminated against. Well, that's very true, but the protected class is race. So someone could argue that they were discriminated against based on their Caucasian race. Now you have kind of an uphill battle because you don't have a history of oppression and discrimination in the same way that you do for the other races. So it's just something to keep in the back of your mind, that it's not necessarily the minority race, the minority gender, the minority national origin or religion or anything like that. It's just the classification itself is protected.
So for those people who say that I'm suffering from reverse discrimination, so you're suggesting that they may in fact have a point? Is that what you're saying?
I mean, from a legal perspective, they have an argument. I can say that. From a personal perspective, potentially, but again, because there's not that kind of there's not a history of oppression and a history of discrimination, they have a hard time proving that they were in fact discriminated against. You know, it's going to be a case-by-case determination. But I mean, there could certainly be situations where, you know, an employer is primarily female and they discriminate against a male, like let's say nursing. We have a profession that's primarily female. A male employee, or let's just say employee, could say, hey, I was discriminated against based on my gender. Now, the male gender is not one we typically think of as being oppressed or discriminated against. We think of them as kind of the oppressor. But in that situation, he very well could have been discriminated against because of his gender, and that wouldn't be incorrect, but it would be very fact intensive.
So you're causing us to think, which is dangerous. Thank you.
Yes. It was a learning curve for me too, because like coming out of law school, I was like, I got a client call and they said they had an employee who was a white female that was claiming discrimination. And I was like, that don't even worry about that. That can't happen. And then it was pointed out to me that it's not what race you are, it's your race that's the protected class. So I had to kind of stop myself and say, oh, well, yes, I guess that could be an issue. What are the facts?
So why do you think why do you think we need, is the way the government talks about these protected classes, talks about affirmative action, are those protections that are they still relevant today? Are those protections that we need today?
Yeah, I think more than ever. I mean, like I said earlier in the conversation, discrimination is more taboo now. It makes it harder to determine the motives of the decision makers, right? So like, they're not going to come out and say, well, I'm not going to hire that person because they're X, Y, or Z, they're going to come up with a million different reasons why that person is not a good fit. So I do think it's important. And moreover, the effects of centuries upon centuries of oppression of, you know, people of color and women and people of different religions don't disappear overnight. You know, we forget we say, oh, well, the 60s was so long ago, but we forget that there are people living in our country today that weren't allowed to apply, much less gain admission to certain schools. They weren't allowed to work at certain jobs, own homes in certain neighborhoods, or own homes at all. People remember not being able to drink from the same drinking fountain as another human being. It hasn't been that long. And even if it had been, you know, 200 years from the equal rights movement and 400 years since slavery, the trauma caused by oppression just doesn't disappear. I'm not a psychologist, but it's interesting. There's been some research into the fact that trauma crosses generations. Trauma, not only in, you know, the way families interact, but also in the DNA of the people. It mutates DNA, it changes DNA. So, I mean, I know that's really deep and goes a little bit further, but I do think that these protections are necessary. I don't think that it's something we can say, well, everyone's kind of equal now. We're good, you know, everyone has the same opportunities. It's not true. It's not true from a cultural perspective, and it's not true from a biological perspective.
So what do you, I'm going to come back to implicit bias in just a second, again, like I said before, but you just touched on something that I thought was very interesting. And you said, because a lot of times I've heard people talk about in hiring panels or in workplaces that a person wasn't the right fit for the organization. Can this idea of fit, how can fit be problematic in terms of disqualifying an applicant in a position, or is that just being overly sensitive that we should be able to have people who fit in our organization without having to respond to any kind of, you know, I'm not being discriminatory. I just want the right person that fits in with what we're doing in this organization. I mean, is fit something we should be concerned with as we look at trying to create diverse organizations or inclusive organizations?
Right. Yeah. And I do think it's a problematic word and an idea, because yes, you want someone who's going to make your company better, but the idea of fit does seem like we want the same. We want the same type of people, which then perpetuates kind of this this privilege and this it's a continuation of the way things have always been done. So I do think it's problematic to use that term fit. And I think the solution, as much as it can be a solution, is to have people that are willing to challenge what that means. What does that mean for this particular person, for this particular role? What are the goals of the company? And, you know, is diversity one of them? Is inclusion one of them?
So, all right, I want to come again full circle. I want to come back to this idea of implicit bias. Now, this is something that's somewhat of a hot topic right now, right? So organizations are all talking about this implicit bias. Can you tell, you know, from your purview, how have you seen implicit bias manifested or problematic in the workforce? So, and I guess maybe for some of us, what is implicit bias from, you know, does it have any legal standings? What is implicit bias?
So from a legal perspective, I don't have a great answer. It's not something that's really been defined really well in the legal kind of realm. You know, I think you know, you spoke about it at a conference last year, and I think it's starting to creep its way in, particularly in criminal law. You know, it's just starting to get footholds in there within the criminal justice system. But as far as like employment law, you know, I don't hear that term a lot. So, and it's really hard then if the term isn't even known, to then try to convince people that they have it, right? Because nobody wants to hear that they have implicit bias. But so yeah, it's not a strongly recognized term, to my understanding.
Okay. So why should I'm an employer, why should I even be concerned with implicit bias? Like, if it's not something that the courts necessarily will ding me for or hold me accountable to, why should I even be concerned with this implicit bias stuff? Or is it just you know, kind of leftist social mumbo jumbo that doesn't really have any bearing in a workforce?
Well, I mean, I think you care about implicit bias if you want your organization to grow into the future, because it's going to affect the perspectives within your organization. So if you want to have a wide variety of perspectives within your organization, you have to explore the idea that you have certain biases towards certain groups of people, and kind of explore those biases. Biases, I don't know the right word, towards those groups, and then move past them, you know, and then say, okay, well, I feel this way because of, you know, this within myself, and it doesn't help me move forward. So I have to set it aside so that I can move forward for what's best for the company. So yeah, I mean, I think to grow the organization, to create a workplace that's diverse and inclusive, you have to explore the idea that that you have your own implicit bias.
So
whether or not that's ever going to be something that the court recognizes, that I don't know. I mean, it's so hard to quantify. It's a social science, right? Harvard does studies on implicit bias, and there's findings that say, yes, we think this exists, but to try to quantify it and then apply it to any one person, you know, we can't do a blood test that says, yes, you have implicit bias, Andre.
That would be great, because then we could get a vaccine. If we could.
Yeah, right, exactly. That wouldn't it be grand?
Yeah. So I know that you. This is on a personal note. I know that you're currently kind of on this journey in working on and looking at your own implicit bias and exploring diversity in expansive ways, right? So the law kind of gives us these close parameters or these closed parameters on this stuff, and you're kind of exploring some of those things outside of that. What has led you to recognize that diversity and inclusion is something that is vital and important in your both professional and personal life?
Oh, that's a good question. So I had kind of a unique opportunity in life, in that I grew up in a neighborhood that was very colorful. I was surrounded by a lot of people of color. I was, you know, one of a handful of Caucasian students in my grade, and I got to experience, you know, kind of, I don't want to say immersion, but I got to experience a lot of other cultures in that way. And I think for me, I just grew an appreciation for those cultures. So for me, it's important to then acknowledge that, you know, my first best friends, you know, have struggles that I don't have, and they have perspective that I want to hear in order for me to kind of understand the world around me. So for me, that's important to kind of explore that. I was having a conversation with a friend last week, and they were doing some implicit bias training at school. He's a teacher. So we were talking about it, and I said, you know, like, first admitting that you have this implicit bias is key. You know, when I am driving in my car, and I roll up to a stoplight, and I see a man, a younger man, black or white, standing on the curb, maybe waiting to cross the street, my instinct is to lock my door. Regardless of whether or not, that guy is doing anything nefarious or there's anything else going on, that's my implicit bias. And I have to recognize that and not necessarily, I don't make myself feel bad about it because it's just part of who I am, but then just say, okay, what are the objective things that are happening in this circumstance? And is this a reasonable response from my body? Or is this just some sort of, kind of knee-jerk reaction, my lizard brain telling me to do something that's not really warranted in this situation? So for me, it's just really important to examine when I'm having a reaction to something to say, well, is this a reasonable reaction to this situation?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. That lots of times there are things that are happening that we're constantly kind of responding to our environment, and very often when we have the opportunity, sometimes the opportunity doesn't present itself, but when we have the opportunity to actually be critical thinkers about our behaviors, I think that demonstrates both our genus, species, and our phylum, right? That we're Homo sapiens sapiens, the ones who know that we exist, that we're cognitive, we're living up to the full level of our potential when we're thinking.
Mm-hmm.
And so, no, thank you for sharing that. I know that's very personal, and I appreciate you being able to share that with our listening audience. Is there any tips that you have for us in terms of trying to build diversity and inclusion in a workforce? What kinds of tips would you give, particularly from an attorney's point of view, in trying to engage in this kind of amorphous thing that the government has kind of laid out on organizations, particularly those of a certain size? What tips or guidance might you give that we won't take as legal counsel or
right.
Tips, just pragmatic ways that you might encourage people to think in engaging in those processes of hiring, retention.
Yeah, I think that, having conversations within the organization in situations where you're not in a hiring or firing situation, right? Because those are always stressful situations, but having, open conversations with your organization about the goals of the organization and the values of inclusion and diversity are important. Now, I think where people kind of struggle with that is that there's conflict involved in that, right? Like, someone's going to say something that is offensive to someone else because that's their perspective. And I think allowing that to happen is really important because that's the only way that you can grow. Because if I'm saying something that's offensive to someone else and it's shut down, I don't feel heard. And people who do not feel heard are not happy people. So you have to let that play out. Obviously, you don't want people to be, defamatory or personally offensive, but people should be a little bit uncomfortable in these situations. That's the only way they're going to grow. I have friends, particularly on social media, that are people of color or, LGBTQ friends who will say things that make me uncomfortable or things that I don't understand or things that are outside my perspective. And my initial response is to be like, well, I don't do that as a white woman, right? Like, I don't do that as a white privileged lawyer woman. And that's okay that that's my initial response, but I always fall back to, well, maybe I do. And let me try to see it from their perspective and let me accept their perspective as their perspective and see how I can do better. I recently read something or saw something about how Black women move out of the way of white women in stores on a general scale. And my first reaction was like, oh, geez, I hope I'm not that rude to anyone, much less to other, women. who I care about deeply. But I stopped and I thought about it, and I was like, you know, even if I don't do this, it doesn't hurt me to be cognizant of it. It doesn't hurt me that when I'm in a store, if I'm at Ulta, I'm not just barging past people, and to just kind of be aware of my own surroundings and the other people in it. So allowing people to be a little bit uncomfortable, allowing people to understand other people's perspectives and try to grow from it, I think is important when you're not hiring and firing, because nobody wants to hear when they're making a hiring and or firing decision, well, you know, is that because so-and-so is a woman, or is that because so-and-so is Black or Hispanic or something like that. Nobody wants to hear it in that situation. But if you can kind of examine these relationships and these interactions in more calm settings, I think that'll solve problems down the road, where people will be already examining their own bias.
Cool. Well, thank you. We'll take that under advisement and really try to create spaces to have those conversations before we need to make decisions, right? So I want to say thank you so much for your time today, so I'll go ahead and close. This is Andre Koen. Speaking of diversity and inclusion from the Mayo Clinic, and we're at
yes, thank you.
So what we will do is I'll make sure you get a copy of this once we get it all prettied up and whatnot, so that you can use it within your networks as well.
Oh, awesome! Thank you so much.
No problem. I will see you in cyberspace.
Yes, sir.
All righty. Have a great day.
Thank you. You too.